What I wanted to do today is talk about the Charvak account of the self. The reason I think I should do it, even though it's a very small class and it's the last week of semester, so you probably want it over and done with. There's some of it is on the exam, so I'll go through it. I won't take the whole 2 hours. We'll hopefully finish it within an hour. But before I do that, 2 things. One, I did send you all an email about student evaluations. And I said I won't send another email, but the minute I did that, that very same day, I got a message that I have been nominated by my faculty to chase up student evaluation for all the philosophy subjects. So, if you wouldn't mind doing it, it would be very useful, at least in my own subject. It won't be that there are not enough student evaluations. And, we do take them seriously, so it would be very nice of you if you spent a few minutes doing it. I'd be very grateful. I'm saying that to all the people listening on the recording as well. The other thing is, do any of you have any questions about anything at all? Sample exam, we did discuss it. For those who were not here, that was done in the lecture before the semester break, so lecture 9, I think it was. So if you want to have a look at the sample exam, we did discuss it. You can go back and listen to that lecture. So as I said before, the real exam will have some overlap with the sample exam. There are some questions which will be directly from the sample exam, and if you prepare all the questions in the sample exam, you'll be perfectly fine in the real exam. They're not the same, but there is considerable overlap. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Charvak account of self, and then we'll call it a day for Indian philosophy. Hopefully we'll finish by 11. So the first thing to discuss here is their main argument against the Hindu. Their target is the Hindu schools, the Brahmanical schools, and the central argument is a very simple one, and I've got it at the top of your handout. Premise 1, the self cannot be perceived. Now they say that the Hindus also agree with this premise. The Nyaya in particular, if you remember, very clearly say that the self is the sort of thing that it's impossible to perceive, make a very strong claim. So you can think of them as, aiming their argument at the Nyaya. Even the Advaita Vedanta, if you remember from Shankar in week 6, he also says the only way to have knowledge of the self is through the Vedas. You can't know it through self-consciousness. What about the Mimamsa view? The Mimamsa who talk about, in memory we perceive. They don't say we perceive, they say we recognize an earlier self. Do you think that counts as perception? Would that count as perception of the self? Would all the Hindu schools agree that the self is not the sort of thing that can be perceived? Premise 1 here. The self cannot be perceived. Does the Mimamsa claim amount to perception of the self? In a sense, I think you're right. I think in a sense the Mimamsa are saying, in memory, they often say things like, in memory, I see myself as being identical to my earlier self. So they use this. But there's a little bit of a difference, it's not entirely correct to say, I think, that the Mimamsa think that the self is the sort of thing that can be perceived. Because when we talk about perception, we are talking about something that is objectively available to everyone. So when I say I perceive 6 students in the class, everyone can perceive those 6 students. Whereas when we talk about perception of the self, it is not the sort of thing that anyone other than you can perceive. And that makes it a bit dodgy. It is only available, if at all it is available, it is only available to the first person, to the person himself. So how many of you would like to say that the self is the sort of thing that can be perceived? Forget about what the Hindus say. Do you think the self can be perceived?
Perceived as in by yourself, yeah. Have you seen The Matrix?
Yes.
Well, you know when they go into the digital world, he's actually bald in real life, but in the digital world he's got hair. And Morpheus goes, hey, do you think, feel your hair, look, you've got hair. And he goes, see, that's how you see yourself, and that's how you project it onto here. So I guess you can perceive yourself. You might be wrong, you might be right, but you can perceive it yourself.
What about the others? Seeing oneself in the matrix? What about seeing oneself in the mirror? Do you see yourself? And that example reminded me, you know, there's an image of you, but is that the self? Yeah. It is kind of, you know, tricky whether you see an image of the self or whether you see a bodily self, or, you know, and it kind of depends on what we mean by the self. So, and let me say, you know, the first premise that the self cannot be perceived of the Charvak argument is dependent on what we mean by the self. And what the Charvaks here are suggesting is that, you know, the self is the sole substance, because this argument is aimed at the Hindu philosophers. That's their target. And if that's the sense in which they're using, that the self cannot be perceived, then I think we have to agree. We might think, you know, we can perceive images of the self, a bodily self, or, you know, other things. Of course, I see myself in the mirror, right? We say, I see myself in the mirror. Or I might see a digital photograph of myself, or, you know, all sorts of videos of myself. Is that really seeing oneself? Well, not in the sense in which what the Hindus mean by the self. So let's agree that the first premise is okay. What about the second premise? Whatever exists must be perceived. That's the Charvak view. Perception is the only source of knowledge. If something exists, then it must be perceived. The reason that they give for accepting this premise is on page 151, down in B. Only the perceived exists. The unperceivable does not exist by reason of its never having been perceived. What do you think? Only things that can be perceived exist? Is that a good premise? No. Why not? Give me an example. Air. Can air be perceived? You can't see it. Perceive is sort of a bit wider than see.
Gravity is another example.
Perceived. Well, you can't perceive gravity, but gravity exists in some sense. Yes. Any other example? When I say perceive is a bit wider than see, you know, things that can be felt are perceived in some sense. So you can feel the gusts of air, or you can feel, if there's no air in the room, you can feel you can't breathe. You know, so in that sense, in that extended sense, perception is not just limited to the eyes. What we hear, what we touch, all those things are perception. So air might not be a good example, because at least the wind, insofar as we do perceive the wind, it throws us around on a bad day. But gravity is an example of, you know, gravity is not something that can be perceived, but we do all agree that gravity exists. Any theoretical entities in physics, you know, that science postulates, in some sense they exist. You know, protons, neutrons, all those subatomic particles that we can't perceive exist in some sense. So it's a very narrow sense of perception, and very narrow sense of existence, when the Charvaks claim that the only thing that exists are the things that are perceived. It's a very dodgy claim. Because it restricts, it's dodgy because it restricts, you know, what we can know And we'll come to that, you know, why do they reject other sources of perception? Just note for now that this premise in their argument, which is really their central claim, perception is the only source of knowledge, is a bit worrying for now. But, you know, if you look at the whole argument, the self cannot be perceived, whatever exists must be perceived, therefore the self does not exist. That's their simple argument, and the worry here, I think, is only with premise 2, but we'll get to that in the second part when we talk about the rejection of the other sources of knowledge. Just very quickly, they give you 2 arguments for the positive account of the self. You know, what does the self look like? One, they say it makes perfectly good sense. The first argument is it makes perfectly good sense to talk about the self in bodily terms. So when we say, you know, we make claims like I am tall, or I am fat, or I am stout, these sentences are intelligible only if the I, the term I, stands for the body. So they say, why not? You know, why not say that the term I stands for the body? Otherwise, these sentences like I am tall, I'm fat, cannot be made intelligible. What do you think of this argument? Would there be any other sense of making, any other way of making sense of sentences such as I'm tall or I'm fat, other than taking the I to stand for the body? Yeah.
And then obviously that soul or self isn't flat and tall.
Yeah.
So I guess but I don't know if you prefer to like, I don't know, because their argument's like specific to the inner self.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's a very good point. That's exactly the point I wanted to make here. That, you know, everyone in the debate, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Charvaks, they are all using linguistic arguments. So they all talk about the reference of the word I. The Buddhists say, of course, it's just a figment of our imagination. There's nothing that the I stands for. Whereas the Hindus, the Nyaya, for example, say that the I cannot mean the body. You know, remember that long argument they give why the I cannot mean the body, because I uniquely identifies you and the body is not unique. You know, you can have a doppelganger or a twin who has exactly the same body. I mean, we know that there were problems with that argument, but it's worth noting here that linguistic arguments are used all over in philosophy, and not just in Indian philosophy. Even in Western philosophy, there is a lot of emphasis on linguistic arguments. But at the same time, you know, linguistic arguments have this feature, because our use of language is so creative and we can, you know, do various things with language. You cannot put much weight on linguistic arguments. You know, they're worrying in a sense, because they can be used to whatever purpose. Because our language is, you know, so malleable. We can say, oh, I use this word in this sense, right? I use this to stand for that. Because our language is so malleable. And it's surprising why people continue to use linguistic arguments in philosophy. It still happens. You know, for all these thousands of years, linguistic arguments are, you know, here to stay in philosophy. But to be honest, I always worry about, you know, what weight we can put on linguistic arguments, because linguistic arguments can go either way. You know, so the Charvaks say back, the Hindus say back, but then how will you make sense of phrases like my body? Right? My body suggests that something owns the body. Like it's, you know, my jacket, my jumper, my body. When I use the phrase, you say, I'm tall, suggests that I stands for the body. But when I say, use the phrase my body, it suggests as if there is something, a self that owns the body. So, you know, that's the point. Linguistic arguments can be used either way, because language is so malleable. And the Charvaks say, oh, no, no, no. we reject my body. That's only a metaphor. You know, there's no owner of the body. Well, the Hindus can just say, when I say I'm fat or I'm tall, I'm just using the term I in a metaphorical sense or a restricted sense or something like that. Next argument is interesting, and it's an important argument. And we've seen this before, but I just want to re-emphasize it. We've seen this before in the context of talking about the debate with Shankar, with the Advait Vedantins. So the Charvaks say that consciousness is an emergent property of matter. What do they mean by that? The only things that exist according to these Charvaks are the four elements: earth, water, fire, and air. Put these four elements together in a certain combination that gives rise to the human form or human body, and consciousness is a new property that emerges. The example that they use is put together the ingredients of wine in a certain combination. So there's yeast, there's grapes, and so on and so forth. None of the ingredients, none of the elements have the property of consciousness, have the property of intoxication. None of the ingredients of wine have that property, but put the elements together, take them through a certain process, and new properties emerge. And consciousness, they say, is exactly like the intoxicating property of wine. Put the elements of matter in a certain combination, the combination that gives rise to the human form, and a new property will arise. And that's the property of consciousness. So emergentism is a very important doctrine. Even in, sort of naturalist philosophy these days, people talk about consciousness as an emergent property of the brain. Rather than talking about matter more generally, they talk about the neural structure and say consciousness, not that it has been proved, but the hypothesis is that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. So it's interesting to note that, all those years ago, and they had these examples to show that new properties can emerge when things are put together in a certain combination. So their view is, if you like, can be called a kind of emergentism about the self. They say consciousness is an emergent property of matter. It's not a separate substance. They're not dualists. The only thing, they're materialists, hardcore materialists, the only thing that exists in matter. Any comments on that one?
That's like another argument in itself, isn't it?
It is another
Sympathize
argument.
with your body.
Yeah, yeah. When the body disintegrates, the human form disintegrates, that's it. The self disappears. Because self is only the coming together of these elements in a certain proportion that gives rise to consciousness. That
Shankar argued that is pretty clearly, there's the dead body, but there's no self. That's
Yeah.
all.
Yeah, that came up in the exchange with Shankar. You're quite right, and he talked about at death there is no self, but what is the But what is the evidence that there is no self? And what is the evidence that the body is there as a whole? One way of defining death is the disintegration of organs. The organs stop functioning. So even though superficially it might seem that the body is all still there, the body is not all still there, because inside it has started disintegrating. At least, that's one way to characterize death.
Well, your arguments is convincing because they're so simple and easy to grasp compared to the other ones. They're just like grasp the body. It's kind of intuitive already, like to what you think if you hadn't read.
See, you think the Charvaks are intuitive?
I think it's more easy to grasp what they're saying than it is to grasping other schools.
Sure. What about the others? More convincing than any of the other schools? That is there. I mean, I agree. We find this easy to grasp, not only because it is an easy language, but it's because, it is very much a feature of our times that we tend to be physicalists and naturalists. We tend to want to explain this is what science is doing. It's telling us more and more about how various parts of the universe work. And so we have this belief that, science will be able to explain everything. But, take it with a pinch of salt. Science does not have an explanation of consciousness. Even now, the biggest problem in science is, how does consciousness emerge? And that's exactly, just to claim it as an emergent property is not yet a scientific proof of consciousness. You need to give us the details. Science doesn't, work on blanket statements like consciousness is a property of brain structures or neural structures or matter. So it is surely easy to accept, because I think we like the belief that science will be able to explain everything. It has explained a lot, and the methods are objective and blah, 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 blah. I could go on saying. But this is still one of the biggest mysteries. Many conferences in science and neuroscience start off with this first sentence: consciousness is the biggest mystery of our times. We still haven't been able to solve it. So, good attempt. We have to give that to the Charvaks. But I don't think we should rest easy and say, oh, they've got the right answer and we've solved the issue once and for all, because we need much more detail before we can think that they're giving the right answer. Just one other point about, they're more general. This is all I had to say about the self. One other point about their general view, the Charvak view, they're very much naturalists. So here's a little quote I'll read out and see what they say about the nature. This is in the context of denying the doctrine of karma. So they say the fire is hot, the water cold, refreshing, cool, the breeze of the morning. By whom came this variety? From their own nature it was born. So they're naturalists in the sense that they say elements have a certain nature, and that's what explains how they behave. We do not need to postulate further hidden causes. Why do things behave in a certain way? Because it's their nature too. Very much a scientific explanation. No further hidden explanation in terms of karma need to be given. And so they go on to say, and this has all been said by Brihaspati, there is no heaven, no liberation, no other world, going through the doctrine of karma again. So they want to deny, they're very much naturalists in the sense that they want to say that things, elements have certain nature, and they behave in a certain way on account of this nature. This view in the earlier times, was called, their view of causation is called svabhavad. Svabhav means the way the thing is. One's own nature explains how a thing behaves. Contemporary terms, you can call it naturalism. Okay, let's do some epistemology to just close this class. I will finish by 11. So in the Indian systems, so especially the Hindu systems, in Hindu philosophy, because that was the established philosophy of the time, they talk about 6 ways of knowing. So they postulate 6 different ways you can find out about the world, you can know about the world. Perception, everyone agrees that that's the main way. Inference, and the Hindus had 4 other things to say. So let me list all the 4. They also had the notion of testimony. You can find out by, listening to others, by reading texts. That's going to be very important for the Hindus because they believe in the authority of the Vedas. Knowledge can be given, knowledge can be had by testimony of others. So that's an important source of knowledge. Vedas, for example, according to the Hindus, are the testimony of the sages. That's number 3. Number 4 is what they call comparison, if you like, which is how do we find out about the meanings of the words? Knowledge of language, they say, is a particular kind of, a particular way of knowing, needs us to postulate a special a special, if you like, way of knowing, and that way of knowing they call comparison, which means it's on the basis of similarity. Let me use an example to explain it. How do we know what the word cow means? You know, how do we know if, so imagine when you're a child learning how to use the word cow, and, you know, mom or dad points to a cow and says, that's a cow. The child might think, you know, the white color a cow? Is the four-legged animals a cow? How do you grasp what's a cow? You know, because first time, when do you think? You know, children often misuse words. So apple, they might think, you know, for example, and this has happened with my kids, apple, they just thought meant a red thing. You know, any red thing, they'd go apple. Well, one of them would go apple. And, no, not apple, tomato. They would say, because for them, the term apple meant a red thing. And so slowly over a period of time, you grasp, you know, that word, term apple, represents this fruit, not red, not a certain shape, not a certain taste, etc., but that particular fruit over a period of time, because you're checked by adults and said, no, this is not an apple, it's tomato. So they think, so red can't be the property they mean by talking about an apple. And so so what drives knowledge of language is what they call is similarity. So over a period of time, children grasp that the term cow stands for this kind of animal. It is amazing how quickly they grasp it. You know, it's one of the most fascinating features, how quickly children grasp what the terms stand for, that cow means this kind of animal, not just a four-legged animal. Initially, they might say a horse, they'll go cow, and you tell them, no, it's not. Few instances like this, and they quickly grasp what, you know, sort of latch on to the property at issue. And that way of knowing, so knowledge of language, the Hindus think requires a special way of knowing, and that they call comparison. Over and above comparison, there is an amazing thing. They think the absence of things is also a way of knowing. So, you know, saying that, you know, this, remember this used to be up here? When I walked into the room before I saw this here, I noticed that this was absent from the table. Now that's finding out something about the world. That's knowing something about the world. You know, seeing that someone is absent, seeing that something is absent, where has it gone? That's knowledge about the world. Knowledge of absences is also knowing about the world. And the Nyaya postulated absence, and they have a reason for thinking why it should be a separate category. I'm not going to go into those reasons. I did mention it earlier in class, but I won't do it again. And the last way of knowing that the Hindus postulate, so we've done perception, inference, verbal testimony, comparison, absence, and the last thing that they postulate is, the last way of knowing is postulation, and they say, you know, you can find out about gravity, for example. You notice that all things, when they're dropped, they go down rather than up. Why? Gravity explains that. So you need to postulate some further things to explain how the world behaves. So there's 6 different ways of knowing, and the Charvaks reject all of them other than perception. Why do they do that? Let me begin with, you know, why they reject inference, because inference is a very important way of knowing. Without inference, you know, our knowledge of the world would be very, very limited. And this is a general problem that I want to draw your attention to. Inference, though our knowledge, science, you know, inference to the best explanation is used all over in science. It's a very important tool for generating knowledge. But there is reason to be concerned about it. Take the simple example on your handout. This is used in the Indian text, especially used by the Charvaks all the time. This is what it says. So, there is smoke on the hill. Wherever there is smoke, there is fire. Therefore, by inference, we can conclude there is fire on the hill. You know, very standard inferences. You see smoke coming out of somewhere, not on the hill. In a certain direction, you think there must be a fire. You ring up the fire brigade to tell them, you know, there's a fire, because you're using knowledge of the second proposition here: wherever there is smoke, there is fire. This proposition, you know, wherever there is smoke, there is fire, has a special status. It is what is called a universal proposition. Notice that in making this claim, wherever there is smoke, there is fire, you are making a very, very strong claim. We are saying all cases of fire are cases, all cases of smoke are cases of fire. And the Charvaks say, what license do you have to make such a strong claim? What license might one have to make such a strong claim? A universal claim, a universal proposition is a very strong claim. You are not just claiming what happens now, you are claiming what happens in the past, you are claiming what will happen in the future, because all cases of smoke are cases of fire, is making a claim about all three times. Take a counterexample. You know, before people from Britain came to Australia, they used to say all swans are white. There were no black swans in the northern hemisphere, right? So your knowledge is only limited to things that have been observed, and extending it to, you know, future instances, making the claim that all cases of fire all cases of smoke are cases of fire, is making what they say. Inference is an unjustified leap in the dark. You are making the claim that the future will resemble the past. And we have often been proven wrong. I gave you an example of the belief that all swans are white. It's only when they came to Australia they realized that that was wrong. That universal proposition that they held was wrong. Universal propositions seem to be making a claim which, you know, that it's not that the claim is completely unjustified. There is some reason to believe that, you know, all cases of smoke are cases of fire. But we don't have, you know, the license to make universal propositions, because universal propositions also include knowledge of the future. And what's the basis for thinking that the future will resemble the past? And this is not a problem that only the Indian philosophers have struggled with. In the West, it is known as Hume's famous problem of induction. Any empiricist, anyone who believes perception is the way of knowing about the world, who believes this, who takes the statement very strongly, is going to have to say our license for universal propositions is not justified. We don't have complete license, because in making a universal proposition, we're not saying all observed Fs are Gs, or all observed cases of smoke are cases of fire. Therefore, you know, I can probably conclude that's not the claim we make. So there's a gap between all observed cases of smoke are cases of fire to the claim wherever there is smoke, there is fire. And what the inference needs is the stronger claim. What inferences use is the stronger claim. And there is no justification for it unless we, and this is something that Hume points out, and I'll put the quote in your handout, unless we say that nature is uniform. So there's a huge issue here. I think, not just the Charvaks worrying about, what gives you the license to use universal propositions that are used in inference, because if so the Charvaks say, how might you know this universal proposition? Well, you can't know it by perception. We just said perception can only give you, perception requires contact, causal contact with the things that you see. And at most, it can give you causal contact with things in the past and in the present. We can't have causal contact with things in the future. So we can never be justified in saying wherever there is smoke, there is fire, if perception is the only source of knowledge. If we use inference again to justify inference, then it's circular, right? Because that other inference will rest on another universal propositions. Inferences always rest on universal propositions. So the only way out of this puzzle, there are few possible ways out of this puzzle. One is to claim that nature is uniform. There is uniformity in nature. The future will resemble the past. Do you think that's a good claim to make, that the future will resemble the past? No? What's the reason to doubt it? It's a good point. What is the reason to doubt that the future won't resemble the past? Because there's still a lot of things that we don't know. There might be lots of hidden causes, so to say. I mean, that's what all that science is about, finding hidden causes. No, it's not, subatomic particles, but something much deeper, string theory, that explains, how things behave. Any other reasons to doubt that the future won't resemble the past? Anyone else? I mean, I think it's, once you start thinking about this proposition that the future, we take it for granted that the future will resemble the past. Otherwise, practical life would be impossible. If I don't know that the future will resemble the past, I might think, if I get up this morning, if I get out of bed, the floor might melt under my feet. Oh, I shouldn't get up. I'm not sure whether the future will resemble the past. So practical action, will be really, really badly compromised if we don't take this assumption. This is something we assume all the time, that the future will resemble the past. You expect, why don't we believe what the weather man or the weather woman tells us on the news? Because we know they're always wrong, and we expect the future to, resemble the past. Even when we, are skeptical, we expect the future. We believe people who are reliable, I don't know who's your favorite news channel or news person, but I tend to believe the ABC to some extent, and I, feel a bit dodgy about 7 News or 9 News, because it's just because of, even when I am skeptical about something, I'm taking this this proposition as, something special, that the future will resemble the past. They've been wrong in the past, they might be wrong again. So I better be skeptical about their claims. I better take their claims with a pinch of salt. They might just be, sensationalizing things. So I think that's all I wanted to bring your attention to, that inference is a very dodgy business, and the Charvaks claim that all other inferences depend on, all other sources of knowledge, the 6 that we talked about, depend on inference, and inference itself is an unjustified leap in the dark. We have no license to say that the future will always resemble the past. This is something we do all the time. Practical behavior would be impossible without this sort of thing. But, that, is not, that is not something we have, good license for. We might try and say that that's what science tries to get at. Science tries to get at hidden causes, and that, sort of it improves our faith in propositions, in universal propositions. Causality might be a good reason. Why should I believe all cases of F are cases of G? Is because there's a causal connection between F and G. But, again, causal connections are themselves based on inferences. And so it's, as they say, turtles all the way down. That's what's holding up our world, turtles all the way down. Just one last thing. I mean, there is, as I said before, there is reason to doubt whether we have the real Charvak position. So part of the text also seems to suggest, that some inferences are justified. Those inferences for which we can have some perceptual evidence. So let me read a little quote from here. This is what they say. From this it follows, so this is again in the context of refutation of karma on page 151. The step which the mind takes, page 151, first new paragraph. The step which the mind takes from the knowledge of smoke, etc., to the knowledge of fire can be accounted for by its being based on a former perception or by its being in error. So that we can look for some justification for it. And that in some cases this step is justified by the result is accidental, just like coincidence. So it might just be, the reason is that it might just be what we think to be a causal connection might just be a coincidence. We can often get these things wrong. And the example of coincidence, they say, employment of gems or charms that people think, this stone is good for you, wearing this stone, or this charm. It's just a coincidence that your day goes better. And, if you leave your charm at home, your day goes badly, and you think, oh, this has got something to do with the charm. Nothing at all. So they say there is reason to doubt that in some cases it might be, the step might be justified, can be accounted for by its being based on a former perception or by its being an error, and that some cases the step is justified because it's just accidental. So we cannot, sort of put much faith in there. And from this, they think it follows that fate, karma, etc. do not exist, because these can only be proved by inference, not by, there is no perceptual justification for these. If you think, all the other sources of knowledge are in doubt, Charvaks will be in a bit of trouble. I mean, if they think you cannot get any knowledge by language or by, believing, why do they always say, this is what the Saint Brahaspati said? They have their founder. So if verbal testimony is not to be believed, if what someone says is not to be believed because there is no evidence for it, knowledge of language is based on inference as well, then the Charvak position should be self-refuting. Why should we believe what they have to say? Because we shouldn't believe what anyone has to say. And that, gets you to the skeptical position, like the famous Greek skeptic. If you don't believe, if you're skeptical about everything, then the only thing you can do is, sort of wag your finger. There's not much point in saying anything if you're going to be skeptical about everything. But again, some people are now in the literature contesting this claim and saying that the Charvaks, this is an unfair representation of Charvaks. There's other Charvak texts which say that they believed in natural inferences, they believed in natural laws, and this, this is a misrepresentation of the Charvak view. So anything you hear about Charvaks, I'm hoping you will do some more Indian philosophy somewhere along the way, but anything you hear about Charvaks, always take it with a pinch of salt, because they were really wiped out by the Hindus. Their texts, their positions and their arguments are not a fair representation. This text that is printed in your study guide is from a compendium of all the various positions. Sardarshan Sangrah means the compendium of all philosophies put together. It's written by someone who's just represented the Charvaks in the mix. This is not the original Charvak text. So whether we are being fair or not here is something that is up for grabs. On that skeptical note, I will call it a day for the Indian philosophy class unless any of you have questions.